Chapter 8, Livestock and the Open Range, 1850 to 1887. The Big Picture. The glory days of the open range were created, and quickly brought to an end, by the same forces that drive all life in Montana: water, weather, and the land. As the bison disappeared from the northern plains, a new way of life spread across the Montana grasslands, the life of the cattleman on the open range. Montana offered 40 million acres of rich grazing land with some of the best grasses in the West. By pushing American Indians onto shrinking reservations, the government opened up vast regions of this public resource. Investors from all over the world came to profit from the open range. The period of open range ranching began and ended in less than 50 years. Yet it profoundly influenced life in Montana. The days of the open range left a lasting legacy that continues to shape life here today. Grassland, the main character in the story. Ranchers found Montana's grasslands to be superior to other areas of the West, like Colorado or Wyoming. Montana's winter snows are not as deep and do not last as long. Winds frequently blow the snow off the grasses, allowing cattle to feed all winter. And many stream beds thread through Montana, providing both water and shelter for the ranging cattle. But the heart of it all was the grass itself: blue grama, buffalo grass, needle and thread grass, western wheatgrass, and other native species. These grasses cured, which means dried, standing up, so the winter snows did not flatten them and cover them up as they did back east. They provided nutritious forage that fattened cattle even with no additional feed. Best of all, it was free. The federal government had claimed wide tracts of land from the Indian tribes, by treaty, which is an agreement between governments, and by force. The land could not be sold or homesteaded until it was surveyed, which means it was measured for mapping. Before the 1880s, very little of the central and eastern plains had been surveyed, other than for the railroad lines. So the stockmen simply claimed it for their own. Like beaver to the fur companies and gold to the miners, the grass was free. The birth of open range ranching. Cattle first came to Montana in the 1830s to supply trading posts and missions. In the 1850s, a fur trader named Richard Grant and his two sons, Johnny and James, started buying lame or exhausted cattle from wagon trains on the Oregon Trail. They drove them north into the Deer Lodge, Beaverhead, and Bitterroot valleys to fatten. Then they drove the fresh cattle back south to the Oregon Trail, trading one fat animal for two weary ones. By 1858, the Grants and other former fur traders were grazing cattle throughout southwestern Montana. Then came the Montana gold rushes. Mining camps sprouted up. Timber camps spread into the woods. The population boomed, and the army brought in more soldiers to protect the new settlers. All these people had to eat. People quickly hunted out the wild game around the mining camps and army forts. The demand turned to beef. Ranching expanded quickly to feed the growing demand. Some gold miners found the beef business more profitable than scratching for gold. In 1862, two businessmen named James and Granville Stewart drove 76 cattle into Bannock and opened a butcher shop. They earned $300, which is equivalent to $5,400 today, in 2 weeks. The government takes more Indian land. As ranching and settlements expanded, stockmen pressured the federal government for more land. The government responded to ranchers' demands. In 1874, President Ulysses S. Grant issued an executive order shrinking the boundaries of the Blackfeet, Gros Ventre, Sioux, and Assiniboine reservation lands. By the early 1880s, most of central Montana had become free grazing land for cattle. In 1882, the government pressured the Crow to cede the western portion of their reservation. As soon as the government claimed these lands, ranchers rushed to fill them up with cattle. The Northern Cheyenne were able to protect their reservation. Their reservation agent did allow neighboring ranchers to lease grazing lands, but he made it clear that the goal was for the Cheyenne ultimately to use the land themselves for their own cattle. By the early 1880s, the railroads were also building through Montana. They, too, pressured Congress to open up Indian lands. Newspapers joined in, too, with editorials reflecting how many non-Indians felt at the time. One editorial from the Helena Herald in the early 1880s said, quote, "These ranges are needed for our cattle, and they are of no use in the world to the Indians." In 1887, the government again reduced the land reserved for the Blackfeet, Gros Ventre, Sioux, and Assiniboine, creating 3 small reservations, the Blackfeet, Fort Belknap, and Fort Peck reservations. 8 years later, the government once more pressured the Blackfeet, this time to sell 800,000 acres of their remaining reservation, an area that today includes Glacier National Park. The Longhorns come north. Most Montana outfits, which means ranching operations, in the 1870s ran breeding stock of Shorthorn, Hereford, and Angus cattle. But as these herds spread north and east from the gold camps onto Montana's plains, they met a rising tide of Texas Longhorns driven in from the south. The first Texas Longhorn cattle drive happened in 1866. Nelson Story, a Montana miner, used his gold profits to buy 600 Longhorns in Texas. He drove them north through Colorado and Wyoming, then into Montana along the Bozeman Trail. Not long after, the period of the Great Texas Cattle Drives began in earnest. Word spread throughout the West that Montana offered vast grazing lands that were free for public use. Cattle operators in Texas, where the grazing lands already were overstocked, began driving their herds north to Montana. One young cowboy named Teddy Blue Abbott later remembered that while driving cattle north to Montana, he was hardly ever out of sight of another herd. One day he said, "I could see 7 herds behind us. I knew there were 8 herds ahead of us, and I could see the dust from 13 more of them on the other side of the river." Since the typical herd included more than 2,000 head of cattle, Abbott counted more than 58,000 head on one section of trail. The 1880s. Cattle boom on the open range. The early 1880s were the heyday of the open range, its time of greatest success and vigor. The populations boomed in the United States and Europe, creating an increasing demand for beef. The Northern Pacific Railroad, completed through Montana in 1883, gave ranchers easy access to markets across the country, and a series of mild winters led many newcomers to think Montana never had harsh weather. Working the range. As more outfits arrived in Montana Territory, cattlemen organized systems to manage the land. The territory was divided into grazing districts. Within each district, individual ranches claimed a customary range just by being the first to graze there. Sometimes the ranch owner would homestead near a water source, a river, creek, lake, or stream, and build a rough ranch house there. Then he would publish a notice in the nearest weekly newspaper describing the boundaries of his range and listing his brand. Operators that let their herds graze without establishing a customary range were sometimes called grass pirates. Water was life on the dry plains, so the ranchers who controlled water sources controlled the land around them. By claiming a 360-acre homestead with a water source, a rancher could control thousands of acres of grazing land. Before barbed wire was invented in 1868, it was impossible to fence off all the grazing land a herd needed to survive. Plus, in the most arid areas, it took 250 acres to feed a cow for a year. A herd of 10,000 cattle needed 2.5 million acres of land to survive. and some outfits ran 40,000 cattle. This was why the open range was so important. The Roundup. Adventure on horseback. Free-range cattle drifted for miles and got mixed up with neighboring herds. So every spring and fall, ranch hands in each grazing district joined together for a roundup, which was a cooperative effort to round up all the cattle in a region, sort them out, brand the new calves, and trail each herd to its home range. A roundup usually lasted weeks and meant hard work for everyone. Cowhands were up at 4 a.m. to look for stray cattle and herd them back to the roundup area. There the cowboys sorted all the cattle into individual herds by their brands, which were marks burned into each animal's hide that identified what ranch it belonged to. The afternoon job was to brand all the calves born since the last roundup. When all the animals were sorted and branded, the hands trailed them to their home range. After the spring roundup, the cattle were turned out again for summer pasture. After the fall roundup, the animals ready for sale were trailed to the nearest railhead for shipping to market. Faces of the range, who they were. To investors far away, the promise of free access to grass, water, and land made the ranching business look pretty good. All across the West, from Texas to Canada, investors bought up or started ranches. Some of the biggest operations in Montana were owned by companies in Missouri, Nebraska, New Hampshire, and Texas, or by investors in England, Scotland, Norway, and France. Of the many fortunes made in the heyday of the open range, most of the riches went to stockholders who had never been to Montana. There were large Montana-owned operations, too. Granville Stewart, Reese Anderson, and Conrad Coors owned a ranch that became the Pioneer Cattle Company. It expanded to 12,000 head by 1883. Frenchman Pierre Wibeau attracted investors from his home country to help him build a large operation in the Beaver Valley along the Montana-Dakota border. Unlike many foreign investors, Wibeau adopted Montana as his home. But most of the cattle ranches were small operations. Soon there were nearly 50,000 different ranchers grazing cattle on the open plains. They grazed herds large and small, ranging from 50 head to 40,000 head. Some of them failed, some became rich, and some made a life for themselves that their descendants carry on today. Ranches on the reservations. As American Indians were forced onto reservations, some became ranchers. Ranching helped Indian tribes expand their economic opportunities, maintain their cultures, and gain independence from government control. It provided a new way to make a living after the bison were gone. Ranching became very important to reservation economies. In 1882, a journalist visiting the Flathead Reservation reported seeing thousands of sleek cattle and fine horses that the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend d'Oreille owned. By 1900, nearly 1/4 of the families on the Blackfeet Reservation owned cattle. Together they registered more than 500 brands and operated 200 mowing machines to cut hay for their stock. They raised cattle for the Chicago market and horses for Montana. In 1903, the Northern Cheyenne purchased 40 bulls and 1,000 cows. 10 years later, the tribe had built a herd of 12,000 head. Their cattle earned some of the highest prices on the Chicago market. Indians on the Fort Peck and Fort Belknap reservations started ranching later. Sometimes there were problems. Neighboring ranchers often let their cattle trespass on reservation lands to graze, competing with the tribal herds. In 1904, the Blackfeet tribe built a fence around their entire reservation to stop the trespassing. The Blackfeet wanted to save the grass for their own cattle. But even a fence did no good. Ranchers simply cut the wire and let their cattle onto the reservation. Nevertheless, Many Indian ranchers preferred ranching over farming. They liked working outdoors, where they could apply their traditional skills of horsemanship. As one historian wrote, Indians could be like white men and yet not be white men through cattle ranching. They were finding new ways to remain Indians. Cowboys, young adventurers on horseback. The daily work of the open range was the realm of the cowboy, young, single, physically capable, and at ease on horseback. Many cowboys were American Indian, Métis, Mexican, or African American. There were also plenty of farm boys from eastern states, and even some sons of English gentlemen who came west for adventure. Like fur trapping and prospecting, cowboying attracted the young. Many were teenagers. Charlie Russell was 16 when he first signed on as a cowboy. James Mooney became a cowboy at 13 and was trail boss at 19. Few men over age 30 had the strength to do the work required. Cowboys rode in bitter cold and wicked heat, pushed through blizzards and dust storms, and endured snake bites, kicking horses, bugs, and driving wind. But cowboying beat other low-wage jobs at the time. Cowboys could earn $20 to $40 per month plus food, which is equal to about $600 today. With few opportunities to spend money on the open range, some cowboys saved enough to buy their own outfits. And many of them simply loved life in the outdoors. They liked the adventure, the freedom, the challenge of working with animals, and the beauty of the open spaces. They enjoyed the camaraderie built by hard work outdoors. Cowboys often eased their boredom by pulling pranks, like slipping a lizard into another's bedroll or putting a greenhorn, which is a beginner, on a horse known for throwing its riders. One outfit loosened the cinch on a cowboy's saddle when he was in town, so when he mounted his horse and spurred it forward, he and the saddle slid off backward, right in front of the townsfolk. Cowboys liked to tell stories on one another, and any man who could not take the teasing was considered too thin-skinned to work with. Women and family life. Like everyone else on a ranch, women worked hard. They washed clothes and household linens by hand in wash tubs outside, and hung them on clotheslines, fences, or bushes to dry. They served as doctor and pharmacist for the cowboys or for sick neighbors. They cooked for family members and the hired help. They often kept the accounts. They grew vegetables and raised chickens. Milk cows, pigs, turkeys, and geese to eat and for sale. Many women mended fences and herded cattle right alongside the men. They helped with branding and haying. I was just like a hired man, remembered ranch wife Katie Adams. Some ranch women found the life terribly lonely. Grace Bendon, who lived on a ranch near Glendive, remembered that non-Indian women were a real curiosity on the open range. One winter, I was the only white woman on a stream 90 miles long, and I did not see a white woman for 6 months, she recalled. Other women enjoyed the natural beauty and expansive horizons. British-born Evelyn Cameron, who ranched with her husband on the Yellowstone River, photographed and wrote enthusiastically about the wide-open Montana landscape. "I think the river is the next best thing to the sea," she wrote to her mother. She loved the ranch, even though everything down to the smallest tin tack had to be hauled in from Terry, 14 miles away. Most ranch children worked too. They were an important part of the family business. A 5-year-old might split kindling. A 9-year-old might drive a team of horses pulling a hay rake or herd livestock on horseback all day. Sheep on the Montana rangeland. Sheep came to Montana at about the same time cattle did. Jesuit priest Father Anthony Ravalli trailed sheep to St. Mary's Mission in the Bitterroot Valley in 1847. The sheep industry began in earnest after 1869, when two ranchers drove 1,500 sheep from Oregon to the Beaverhead Valley near Dillon. Soon after that, the Poindexter Ore Cattle Partnership brought in 2,467 sheep to add to their livestock. Sheep spread eastward along with the cattle. By early 1879, there were 15,000 sheep in the Smith River region and 60,000 on the Musselshell River. Many Montana ranchers in western and central Montana raised both sheep and cattle, and in many ways the two industries grew together. Both relied on the free grasses of the open range. During the good years, both industries made good profits. In bad years, conflicts sometimes arose as cattle and sheep competed for rangeland. In other regions, Wyoming for example, those conflicts erupted into violence. But in Montana, so many ranchers ran both cattle and sheep that there were far fewer conflicts between cattlemen and sheepmen. Sheep also attracted many small investors. Sheep weathered Montana winters well, could be raised at lower cost than cattle, and yielded annual profits from the wool. Annual shearings made sheep more affordable than cattle, which had to be fattened 2 or 3 years before they could be sold. The sheepherder. Experienced immigrants come to the plains. Sheepherders were a different breed from cowboys, but were just as important to Montana's early livestock days. Most of them were experienced sheepmen who came from other countries: Scotland, Portugal, the Basque region between Spain and France, Mexico, and occasionally Norway, Ireland, or England. The sheepherder had to be self-reliant. He often worked alone with his dog for months on end. He had to cook, clean, mend, and provide for himself while out with the flocks. Though he traveled on horseback, he did much of his work on foot among flocks of 1,500 to 3,000 sheep. He protected his flocks from bears, coyotes, and wolves, as well as from pests, parasites, and poisonous plants. Most of a sheepherder's work entailed watching for danger, for weather, for predators, for any kind of mishap. Sheepherders did not become the romantic legend that cowboys became, but sheepdogs, those loyal, intelligent, often heroic workers of the open range, sometimes did earn legendary status. Sheepdogs were invaluable for keeping the herds together, for warning off predators, and for keeping lambs out of trouble. Sometimes it seemed as if a dog could read the herder's mind, remembered Henry and John Murray, who grew up on a Judith Basin sheep ranch. The dogs worked with voice commands as long as they could hear the herders and watched for arm signals which the dogs could see a mile or so away. Horse raising on the reservation and off. Horses have been part of life on the northern plains since the 1700s. Many ranches bred horses along with cattle and sheep. Montana's horses soon gained national attention for their quality, both as working mounts and as racehorses. Many Indian ranchers preferred raising horses over cattle. Traditionally, an Indian family's horses were a measure of its wealth. Many Indians thought there was more dignity in raising horses than cattle. As Crow Indian historian Joseph Medicine Crow wrote, "To be a Crow rancher in those days was to raise horses." British ranchers in Montana often raised horses too. Some tried to make their fortunes raising ponies for polo, which is a British game played on horseback. Others raised war horses to sell to the military. One wealthy miner named Noah Armstrong began raising and breeding thoroughbred racehorses on his farm near Twin Bridges in 1885. One of his prize horses, named Spokane, won the 1889 Kentucky Derby. In the 1890s, Marcus Daly, a copper baron, built the Bitterroot Stock Farm, where he raised thoroughbreds, pacers, and high-quality cavalry horses that he sold to the government. And of course, ranchers raised horses to work the land, cow ponies for cowboys to ride, and large, heavy draft horses to pull farm equipment. Montana ranches relied on horses until the 1920s, when automobiles and tractors began to take over. Problems of the open range. The open range was free and wide open, but it also presented some problems for ranchers. Prairie fires swept across the range. Wolves, coyotes, and other predators sometimes killed significant numbers of animals. Winter blizzards, spring floods, lightning, insects, and hail could be devastating, and none of the ranchers could entirely control land they did not own. Sometimes unbranded calves became mavericks, which were unidentified calves that wandered off from their mothers. Ranchers generally agreed that a maverick became the property of the ranch onto which it strayed. This agreement caused problems when some ranchers began mavericking, indiscriminately branding any stray calf they saw. Cattle rustling, which is rounding up horses or cattle for thievery, was far too easy on the open range. Rustlers rounded up branded cattle, altered the brands, and quickly led them across the border into Dakota Territory, or Canada, for sale. Law enforcement was difficult over such vast, open distances. Some cattlemen illegally took the law into their own hands. Most notorious was a group of ranchers called Stewart's Stranglers, because they were organized by Granville Stewart. The Stranglers killed at least 15 suspected cattle rustlers in Montana in 1884, then proceeded across the border into Dakota and killed even more. But the worst problem was overgrazing. Each rancher wanted to expand his or her own herd. There was no authority to determine when there were more cows and sheep feeding in a region than the grassland could sustain. Ranchers organized to solve problems. It did not take long for ranchers to realize that there were some problems they could not deal with on their own. To handle common difficulties, stockmen and sheep ranchers organized into associations. Cattle ranchers formed the Montana Stock Growers Association, and the sheepmen organized to form the Montana Wool Growers Association. Together, these groups wielded enough economic and political power to get attention from the territorial legislature. These associations worked with the legislature to pass laws regulating grazing on public land. They hired detectives to check brands on cattle and pressured the state to register brands. They persuaded the legislature to hire a veterinarian to help solve disease problems and to create a board of stock commissioners to enforce branding and other laws of the open range. The hard winter of 1886 to 1887. Even the ranching organizations could not prevent overgrazing, and because the open range was a common resource, no individual company was motivated to conserve or protect the water, grasses, or soils. Spring of 1885 found 500,000 head of cattle on the Montana range. The grasses became seriously depleted. That autumn was unusually dry. Water holes shrank and disappeared. Range fires burned up large sections of cured grass. The open range was headed for disaster. In the spring of 1886, 100,000 more cattle and large herds of sheep arrived on the Montana plains. After a hot, dry summer, winter came early, with heavy snows and fierce winds that made the snow as hard as cement. Little had been done to put up hay for winter feeding. A thaw came in December. When it froze again, ice-caked the exposed clumps of grasses. The weakened cattle could not paw through the ice to get at the grass. In February, a deep freeze returned. Some ranchers reported temperatures of 63 degrees below zero. Despite some heroic efforts by cowhands across the region, tens of thousands of cattle froze or starved to death. Starving cattle staggered through village streets, collapsed, and died in dooryards, wrote historian Joseph Kinsey Howard about the winter of 1886 to 87. 5,000 head invaded the outskirts of the newborn city of Great Falls, bawling for food. They snatched up the saplings the proud city had just planted, gorged themselves upon garbage. Some experts estimated that Montana lost 362,000 head of cattle that winter, 60% of the Montana herds. Losses were greatest in the eastern part of the state, where some cattle companies lost 90% of their herds. Smaller, more experienced ranchers in central Montana lost far fewer, about 40% of their cattle. There were also dishonest ranch managers who reported huge losses to their owners to cover up for their own mismanagement of records. So it was impossible to count how many animals actually died that winter. The winter of 1886 to 87 was a turning point for Montana's cattle industry. Never again would ranchers operate so recklessly on the northern plains. Recovery came quickly, with tough lessons learned. The disastrous winter of 1886 to 87 changed the cattle industry on the northern plains. Losses from that terrible winter drove hundreds of outfits out of business. Many of them were big ranches that focused on short-term profits. The outfits that survived ran things differently from then on. They began putting up hay and planting barley for feed to see the animals through the winter. They reduced the size of their herds and worked instead to improve the quality of their stock through careful breeding. Ranchers realized they had to start caring for water, soil, and grasses to remain prosperous. Many ranchers fenced grazing ranges to keep their cattle from wandering. Fences also helped prevent overgrazing by keeping other people's cattle out. Some ranchers even profited from the hard winter. When bankrupt operations sold off their remaining cattle, the more carefully managed ranches bought up their livestock at low prices. With less beef on the market, their profits increased. With fewer cattle on the range, Montana's grasses recovered quickly. Technology helped, too. Improved syringes helped stockmen inoculate cattle against diseases. Windmills to pump water, barbed wire for fencing, and new equipment like fence post hole diggers, mowing machines, and hay rakes made ranch management easier. Some large operators, like the Frenchman Pierre Wibeau, found new investors and continued to grow. But after 1887, Montana's cattle ranches were mostly in the hands of smaller, locally owned outfits. Sheep had weathered the hard winter much better than cattle had, so sheep ranching increased dramatically. Besides, ranchers learned that it paid to run two kinds of livestock. If cattle prices were depressed, they could still make money from wool and mutton. Montanans expanded their sheep herds, and new investors appeared on the scene. By 1900, Montana was the nation's top sheep-growing state, with 6 million sheep. And by 1904, it became the nation's largest wool producer, shipping out 37,773,000 pounds of wool. The open-range system that began with such optimism in the 1870s lasted barely until 1900. A stockman either sold out or adapted to his new circumstances, becoming a rancher-farmer combination. He continued to graze cattle and sheep in fenced pasturage, but also planted and harvested hay, barley, wheat, and other crops. Some ranches in northeast Montana continued the open range system, but increasingly, roads, railroads, miles and miles of barbed wire fences, and homesteads hemmed in the wide open grasslands. The legacy of the open range. As short-lived as the open range era was, it left a lasting legacy. Hollywood made hundreds of movies about the cowboy, the expert, capable loner on horseback with his cowboy boots, his hat tipped low over his brow, and his reputation for honesty and straightforwardness. He is celebrated in country and western music, in cowboy poetry, and in clothing stores all across the country. Politicians wear cowboy boots to indicate that they are down-home Montanans. Country singers wear Stetson hats to identify themselves with a certain audience of people. One of the most sensational legacies of the open range is the rodeo. The word rodeo is Spanish, meaning gather together. Rodeos originated in Mexico with the vaqueros, Spanish for cowboys, and moved north with the cowboy culture. The first rodeos were simple competitions at roundup time. Cowboys competed against one another to showcase their everyday skills on horseback, bucking horse contests, roping and cutting competitions, and horse races. Spectators bet on the winners, and cowboys often went home from roundup with their winnings in their pockets. When the years of open-range cowboying ended, cowboys began joining professional rodeos. These rodeos appealed to Americans fascinated by cowboys and the Wild West. Dude ranches also profited from Americans' fascination with the open range. Across Montana, ranches opened their doors to vacationers who wanted to experience the West. These vacationers were known as dudes, so the ranches that hosted them became known as dude ranches. Montana's first dude ranch probably opened in the 1890s. The industry grew, especially when low prices for beef made it hard to make a living raising cattle. By the 1930s, there were over 150 dude ranches in Montana. Today, dude ranching is an important part of Montana's tourism industry. The open range shaped our Montana. If you live in ranching country, you have a lot in common with people living during the era of the open range. Ranchers today drive pickup trucks, work computers, and implant computer chips in their cattle for identification. Yet they face many of the same challenges as their ancestors did: isolation, unpredictable weather, unending hard work, changing market prices, and even cattle rustling. Like their ancestors, their lives are shaped by land, weather, and outside market conditions. And they are continually learning to be better stewards of the land, plants, and animals. Craig and Tanya Martin raise cattle, sheep, and 4 children on a Wheatland County ranch that has been in Craig's family since 1889. They say they like living 25 miles from a grocery store and 100 miles from people. Even working constantly, their biggest challenge is figuring out how to make a living. You have to be ingenious and industrious, or your place is on the farm auction sale, Craig says. They started an excavation business to earn more income. High costs of land and fuel, the need for a lot of land, and low market prices keep most of today's ranches from expanding. The older ranchers say there's no way they could get where they are today if they had to buy their land now, Craig said. The returns on our work are so low, probably most of us could make more money if we sold our places and put the money in a savings account. You do it for the love of it. This love of the land and the work is one of the most important legacies of Montana's ranching heritage.
Expressions of the people.
The art of Charles M. Russell. In 1880, Charles Marion Russell came to the Montana Range. The son of a wealthy St. Louis businessman, he was 16 and eager for adventure. 2 years later, he signed on as a horse wrangler on a cattle drive. He was not a particularly good roper or rider, but the other cowboys liked him because he could draw and tell good stories. He was such a good storyteller that when he started talking, all the other cowboys gathered around. A fellow cowboy named I.D. O'Donnell said, "In the evenings in the bunkhouse, the crowd usually got to spinning yarns and telling stories or singing songs. Charlie would be mum, which means silent, until everyone was finished, and then he would tell his story that outclassed them all, and then he was mum." During the hard winter of 1886 to 87, Russell was working at the O.H. Ranch. When a cattleman wrote the O.H. asking about the conditions of its herds that winter, Russell answered with a picture of a starved and near-frozen steer circled by wolves. His watercolor, Waiting for a Chinook, started Russell on his career in art. Russell later moved to Great Falls and set up a studio. He gains an international reputation as a cowboy artist, preserving in his paintings, sculptures, and stories the spirit, activities, and details of a way of life in the West that was already quickly disappearing.
A few of his paintings illustrate this chapter.
Russell once said, "Any man that can make a living doing what he likes is lucky, and I'm that." He created more than 4,000 works of art in his lifetime. When he died in Great Falls in 1926, all of Montana mourned his passing.